The best way to understand what a K-tip knife is would be to first understand where the K in K-tip comes from, and that would be from the Kiritsuke. I have 3 Kiritsukes here. The first is the Enso Ginsan. This would be the most traditional Kiritsuke that I have in my entire collection. But this is a double bevel. A traditional Kiritsuke is a single bevel slicing knife. So on one side, it's dead straight. On the other side, you have the sharpened edge, where a double bevel would be a 50-50 grind on each side. So aside from that, this is traditional as it comes, with the octagonal handle, the length, the tip of the knife, which is where the K-tip comes from. And then next I have the Shun dual core, traditional octagonal handle, very traditional looking blade shape, except this has a bolster, so it's a little bit more modernized. And the last would be the Enso SG2 Kiritsuke. This has a bolster as well as a more Western style micarta handle. So we go from the most traditional to a little bit more modern Kiritsuke style knives. The thing that's important to understand though would be the blade shape of all of these would be traditional Kiritsuke if they were single bevel, but these are all double bevel. Real quick, Kiritsuke, Kiritsuke, I've heard a bunch of ways to pronounce Kiritsuke. That's how I gravitated towards saying it over watching a bunch of videos from folks from Japan. So I'm just gonna stick to it. Call it whatever you want, call it a K-tip. I don't care. I'm from New Jersey, so pronouncing some of these different words are a little challenging, as they may well be for you as well. Now that we understand the Kiritsuke, let's dive into what makes a knife a K-tip. I have a couple knives here that have K-tips, but they go by different names, like the Bunka and the Honesukes or Honesukes. And then I have some other knives that are just random with K-tips. And we'll have a little thought experiment as we go throughout here and you get to see the different knives. I'm gonna leave the Enso Ginsan up there for comparison purposes. Now, first one I want to show you would be the Bunka. The Bunka here, that's the Yoshikane Shirigami white carbon steel with stainless cladding, and this is the Enso hand-forged Bunka. The biggest difference between these two would be the curvature at the tip of the blade, as well as the angle of which it comes down at the spine. As you can see, the Enso is a little bit harder of a downward angle. But if you look at the traditional Kiritsuke, they all have a very similar tip. So is this a Bunka or is it a K-tip Nikiri? And the reason that I bring that up, here's a Nikiri, is there are some brands like Nigara, for example, that if they have a very straight edge profile with a relatively even spine height throughout the entire blade, they will label it as a Kiritsuke Nikiri. Meanwhile, other brands that have a very curved profile will just call it a Bunka. But if you're gonna call one a K-tip Nikiri, but not something else K-tipped and just call it a Bunka, look at this. These are the Hatsuko Koro Kirogane hand forge from Japan. Amazing for the price, by the way. They're $99 and $99, and some of the others are even less than that. Really cool knives. They need a little work on the whetstone, but it's well worth it, believe me. Anyway, this is the Bunka. This is their Santoku. But if you were to come in here and just put a harder angle on that, you essentially have a Bunka. So in a way, you could get away with calling this a K-tip santoku, because other companies, other knife makers that have a different edge profile will call the very thing that looks near identical something different. And this is where K-tip and a lot of these names can be used loosely. And what we will say, even though I'm going to kind of intentionally create some confusion here just for this thought experiment, what we do at Cutlery More is we go by the name that the maker, the brand, the company gives us for their knives. So if one person wants to call this a bunka, the other person wants to call it a K-tip Nikiri or something else, a K-tip santoku, well, that's what we're just going to go by. Okay, moving on. The bunka, for the most part, is a K-tip that is essentially just a shorter Kiritsuke. That's just the best way to describe it. Kiritsuke, you're looking like 8+ inches, whereas a bunka, for the most part, you're in that 6 to 7 mark. And then when you get smaller, you go into what's called a ko bunka, K-O, not K for like Kiritsuke, K-O, ko bunka, baby bunka. So as you can see, these both have a K-tip. They're considered bunkas. This is what I want you to look at now. This is, I'm going to get rid of the little guy here, a Honesuke or Honesuke. So this ko bunka looks very similar to these two knives that are called Honesukes. So all the Honesukes you come across will have this K-tip, but they're generally a much more narrow height at the edge to the spine at the tip compared to the heel. These are traditional boning knives. Some of these are phenomenal for everyday prep, depending on how thin their blade is as well. The Moritaka here, this has a much wider spine and wider geometry going down, so much better for boning compared to the much thinner Shun Honesuke. So this Hatsukokuro Kirogane, could you get away with calling that a Honesuke? Or call all three of these K-tip prep knives? Again, it would be completely up to the maker. Okay, I guess I have one more little one here. This is the Wüsthof Asian prep knife, which again looks basically like a Honesuke, but they're giving it a different name. Who knows? Maybe they'll change it in the future and it'll just be their K-tip petty. Who knows? Now, the rest of the knives that I have do not have official names in the sense of like the bunka with its K-tip or the Honesuke with its K-tip. Now, where you're going to see a lot of K-tips added in front of knife names would be with the Gyuto. So the Gyuto here, the Yoshikane SKD, this is their stainless steel. Here is the Steelport chef's knife, which is getting into a K-tip because of that harder downward angle there. This is the Kiritsuke K-tip Gyuto. And then I'm going to get rid of the traditional one here. This is the Nigara SG2 K-tip Gyuto. So all of these are Gyutos that then have that tip cut down on a much harder angle compared to the softer curvature of the Gyuto, or look at the Santoku. It's a very similar shape to the Gyuto in this sense, but there again are different curvatures to both Santokus and Gyutos. For example, if we were to look at the Wüsthof Classic Icon Santoku, that has a much harder downward curve with a very straight edge profile compared to the more traditional Japanese Hatsukokuro Kirogane. So again, there's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to how these knives are named. Again, This, I would say, is where you're going to find K-tip used in front of a style most often, would be with the K-tip Gyuto. Speaking of Gyuto, I go back and forth. Gyuto is how I believe it should be pronounced. I say Gyuto. I think we all know what I'm referring to. Okay, this is the Zwilling Rocking Santoku. It's very reminiscent of a kobunka, but a little bit more of a curvature at the tip, which Nigara would call this probably something closer to a bunka compared to their Kiritsuke Nikiri that would still look very similar to the Enso hand-forged bunka. So is this a K-tip? You tell me. Here's a fun one. This is the Town Cutler made in Reno, Nevada chopper. Now this has a very, very long tip to it in the sense of, unlike some of the others, if you look at the length of the blade compared to where that angle starts to come down, this is very pronounced. Now they just call that their chopper. Easy breezy, simple name. It's their own thing. But compare that to the Dalvua, I hope I'm pronouncing that right again, Kiri cleaver. So Kiri, K-I-R-I, in the sense of Kiritsuke, K-I-R-I-T-S-U-K-E. So this is just called a chopper. This is called a Kiri cleaver, or for short, a K-tip cleaver. Okay, a couple more and we're gonna wrap up. This is the Messermeister, what was originally called their carbon chef's knife. That's how we have it on our website because that's how it was delivered to us. Well, now they're calling this a bunka. This is also 8 inches long, which is getting long for a bunka. So is this a bunka or is this a K-tip Gyuto or a K-tip chef's knife? I think they changed the name, or maybe we've got something wrong. I don't know, but either way, it's a K-tip and it's 8 inches long. Bunka, Gyuto, chefs. What would you call it? And then 2 more, the last bit. This is the Shun Shiranami Master Utility, which you could probably get away calling a K-tip Ko Nikiri. In fact, let's look at the Nikiri. So Ko meaning a little bit smaller. Well, I guess the blade length is about the same. Actually, it's the same. Nikiri Master Utility. Is it a K-tip utility? Is it a bunka? I mean, you could almost call that a bunka if you were to put that up next to the Enso Handforge. This is a little shorter. Maybe it's a kobunka, like the other Enso here. It's a master utility because that's what we named it. This is one of our exclusive series that we have with Shun. And last but not least, the Takayuki 11.8 inch Yanagiba. This is a blade, I tell you. Amazing slicer. This is a K-tip Yanagiba. Now, when you look up various Yanagiba knives, you will see some that have a tip very similar to the Yoshikane Gyuto here, as well as others that have a less pronounced, more rounded spine right here, but not quite as rounded as that. It's a K-tip Yanagiba. Why? Because that's the name that they gave it, and that's the name that we are going to honor. So there you have it, folks. What is a K-tip? It is a knife that is inspired by the original Kiritsuke. I'm Chef Brandon with Cutlery and More. Thanks so much for watching. Comment in the video below with any of your thoughts on what you would call some of these knives. Would you call them a K-tip? Would you call it a Kiritsuke Nikiri? Would you call it a Bunka? Would you call it a K-tip Santoku? It'll be a fun little experiment to see what people end up coming up with. Thanks for tuning in.